Alaska is separated from the rest of the United States by almost 800 kilometers of Canada. It's so far north that parts of it lie inside the Arctic Circle, and at its closest point, Alaska sits just a few kilometers away from Russia. Yet, somehow, this enormous piece of land belongs to the USA. And it isn't just any piece of land. Alaska is larger than France, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom combined. It contains vast oil reserves, some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, and one of the more strategically important locations in the world. But less than 160 years ago, none of it belonged to America. It belonged to Russia. So why did Russia give up an area more than twice the size of Texas? Why did the United States want a frozen territory thousands of kilometers away from Washington? And how did what looked like one of the strangest purchases in history become America's greatest bargain and Russia's biggest regret? The story begins long before either Russia or the USA controlled Alaska. Indigenous people had lived across the region for thousands of years. These included the Ononga people, who lived a subsistence lifestyle with an efficient and successful maritime economy in the Aleutian Islands. Then, during the 1700s, Russian explorers began crossing the Bering Sea. Russia had spent centuries expanding eastwards across Siberia. Eventually, it reached the Pacific Ocean, and across the water was another enormous territory. But the Russians were not initially interested in Alaska because of its land. They were interested in it because of its animals. Alaska's waters were filled with sea otters, whose thick fur had become extremely valuable, particularly in China. Russian traders began establishing settlements along the coast and forcing many of the Ononga hunters to collect fur for them. The consequences were devastating. Violence, exploitation, starvation, and newly introduced diseases destroyed communities, and the Ononga population alone declined dramatically during the period of Russian colonization. In 1799, the Russian-American Company was created to control the colony and its fur trade. Russia now had a foothold in North America, but controlling Alaska was much harder than just simply claiming it on a map. Alaska was thousands of kilometers away from Russia's main population centers. Supplies had to cross Siberia or even travel across the enormous stretch of ocean. There were a few Russian settlers, but very limited infrastructure and almost no military presence capable of defending such a vast territory. And the colony's main source of income was beginning to disappear. Sea otters had been hunted so aggressively that their numbers collapsed. As the fur trade declined, Alaska became less profitable and increasingly difficult to maintain. Then, Russia developed a much bigger problem: Britain. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, Russia had found itself fighting Britain and its allies. Britain had already controlled neighbouring Canada and possessed the world's most powerful navy. If another war broke out, Russia feared Britain forces could simply invade Alaska from Canada. Russia would lose the territory and receive absolutely nothing in return. Selling it started to make sense. But Russia didn't want to strengthen Britain by selling Alaska to them. Instead, it turned to Britain's fastest growing rival in North America, the United States. For the United States, Alaska fitted into a much bigger ambition. Throughout the 1800s, America had expanded relentlessly westwards. It had purchased Louisiana from France, annexed Texas, gained territory from Mexico, and pushed all the way up the Pacific coast. Many American politicians believed this expansion was inevitable. The United States was no longer supposed to remain a collection of states along the Atlantic. It was supposed to become a continental and, to be honest, even a global power. One of the strongest believers in this was Secretary of State William Seward. Seward believed Alaska could provide valuable natural resource, new trading opportunities, and greater American influence across the Pacific. It would also remove Russia from North America and prevent Britain from eventually taking the territory. So when Russia offered to sell, Seward was interested. Very interested. Negotiations stifled in March 1867. According to the story, Seward and the Russian minister, Eduard de Stockel, worked together through the night to complete the agreement, and by 4 o'clock in the morning, the deal was done. The United States would purchase Alaska for $7.2 million. That worked out roughly to 2 cents per acre. Today, paying $7.2 million for Alaska sounds almost absurdly cheap. But in 1867, many Americans were far from convinced. The country had only recently emerged from the Civil War. Hundreds and thousands of people had died. Much of the South had been absolutely obliterated, and the federal government forced the enormous cost of reconstruction. So why was it spending millions on a distant frozen wilderness? Critics would mock the purchase, and in newspapers they would call it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. Some believed Alaska contained nothing but snow and polar bears, really. The US Senate approved the treaty, but the House of Representatives delayed providing the money for more than a year. Eventually, however, the purchase was complete. On the 18th of October, 1867, Russian and American soldiers had gathered in Sitka. The Russian flag was lowered and the American flag was raised, and Alaska was officially passed into US control. But this transfer was decided entirely between two empires. Alaska's indigenous inhabitants were not consulted. The treaty transferred Russians' colonial claims to the USA, along with the people living in them. America now owned Alaska, but the problem is that the US had no clue what to do with it. For decades, Alaska remained largely ignored by the rest of the country. The United States Army governed it at first, followed by a mixture of federal agencies. There were very few permanent American settlers there at the time, and there was no elected territorial government. Then they struck gold, quite literally. During the late 1800s, major discoveries of gold across Alaska and neighboring Canadian Yukon brought tens of thousands of prospectors north. Towns appeared almost overnight, ports expanded, new transport routes were created. Suddenly, the frozen territory that America had supposedly wasted its money on was now producing enormous wealth. And gold was only the beginning. Alaska would later become valuable for its timber, fisheries, minerals, and oil. In 1968, one of North America's largest oil fields was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's northern coast. The pipeline built to carry this oil south would eventually stretch over 1,300 kilometers across the state. The purchase price had already been repaid many times over, but Alaska's greatest value was not only buried beneath the ground, it was also visible on the map. Let's take a look at the map for a minute. Alaska sits between North America and Asia. That once upon a time made it distant and useless. But as aircraft, submarines, and long-range missiles changed this landscape of warfare, that distance became strategically vital. During the Second World War, Japanese forces occupied the Alaskan islands of Attu and Kiska, the only parts of what is now the United States to be occupied by a foreign enemy during war. Alaska became an important base for defending the North Pacific and sending American aircraft to the Soviet Union. Then came the Cold War. Suddenly, Alaska was positioned directly beside America's greatest rival. US and Soviet territory was separated by the narrow Bering Strait. Radar stations, air bases, and early warning systems were constructed across Alaska to detect a potential Soviet attack. The territory Russia had considered too remote to defend had become one of America's most important defensive positions. And in 1959, nearly a century after the purchase, Alaska officially became the 49th state. Russia sold Alaska because it believed the territory was very remote, unprofitable, impossible to defend, and to be quite honest, they were broke. The United States saw something very different. What many dismissed as Seward's Folly became one of the greatest bargains in history. Alaska would later reveal vast reserves of gold and oil, become a strategic military stronghold during the Cold War, and grow into America's largest state. But perhaps the biggest lesson in this: the true value of land isn't always obvious at the time, but what looks like a frozen wasteland today can become one of the most valuable places on Earth tomorrow. If you enjoyed the video and want to read more about the purchase of Alaska, I've included some links in the description. And if you've been enjoying the content lately, like the video and consider giving the channel a subscribe. And stay tuned for the next video.